Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
The clink of silverware against china had that hollow sound that comes when people are laughing at your expense, not with you, and I sat there with my wine glass halfway to my lips when my father leaned back in his chair, patted his stomach like the king of his little castle, and said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "Well, congratulations, honey, but let's be honest, your sister's the one we're really proud of." The words landed with the kind of force that only comes from repetition, because it wasn't the first time, not by a long shot, and everyone knew it. My mother gave a thin smile, my sister smirked into her napkin, and I felt that familiar burn in the back of my throat, the one that reminded me that no matter what I did, I was always the afterthought in their story. I had worked for years, grinding through 12-hour shifts, pulling together projects nobody else wanted, carrying teams on my back until my spine felt ready to snap, and tonight was supposed to be about finally being recognized for it. My boss had arranged this dinner, not just to celebrate my promotion, but to let my family see that I wasn't some shadow trailing behind the golden child. But in one casual sentence, my father brushed it aside as though what I'd earned was little more than a participation ribbon compared to the shining halo he and my mother kept carefully perched on my sister's head. The room grew quiet after his comment, the laughter drying up as quickly as it had started, and I saw my boss lower his fork, the way a man does when he's decided the conversation has veered into territory he cannot ignore. He looked at me, then at my father, then finally at my sister, whose smirk had widened into something close to smug delight. My boss reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate calm, and the shift in his expression made my stomach tighten, though I had no idea what was coming. He pulled out a plain envelope, one of those long white ones you recognize instantly as carrying something important, and slid it across the polished wood toward my father with the kind of finality that silences even the most arrogant voices. "This," he said quietly, almost conversationally, though the undertone was sharp enough to cut through bone, "is what your daughter received this morning." My father frowned, confused, his hand hovering over the envelope as though it might sting. My sister's smirk faltered, just slightly, and I could see her knuckles tighten around her wine glass. My mother shifted in her chair, eyes darting from the envelope to my boss's face, searching for some clue in his steady calm. My father finally opened it, his large hands fumbling with the fold, and when he drew out the crisp letter inside, the air around the table seemed to stop moving. I watched him read, his lips moving silently, the way he always did when the words in front of him carried weight. His eyebrows knit together, the color draining from his face, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, my father had nothing to say. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable kind that comes when people have said all they needed. It was heavy, oppressive, the kind that presses down on the lungs and makes breathing feel like effort. My sister's face went pale, and I could see the edges of panic in her eyes as she tried to maintain composure, but the act was slipping, and everyone at that table knew it. My boss leaned back, folding his hands neatly on the table, and continued in that same even tone. She thought she was untouchable, but her employment was terminated effective immediately. It's a shame, really, but actions have consequences. He let the words hang there, heavy and deliberate, and every person in the room shifted uncomfortably except me. I sat still, the sting of my father's dismissal still hot in my chest, but beneath it, something else was blooming, a strange, sharp satisfaction, the kind you don't ask for but recognize instantly when it arrives. The table, once alive with chatter and wine-fueled laughter, now felt like a courtroom after the verdict has been read. My father's hand trembled as he set the letter back on the table, his eyes fixed on the words as though staring long enough might alter their meaning. My mother's lips parted, then closed, no defense rising to her tongue. My sister finally broke the silence with a strained laugh, the kind people use when they're scrambling to pretend something isn't real, but it echoed falsely in the dim light of the restaurant. No one joined her. I should have felt pity, maybe even guilt, but all I felt was the steady thrum of vindication. I had spent years swallowing their jokes, enduring their dismissals, living in the long shadow of the sister they adored. Tonight was supposed to be mine, but my father's cruelty had nearly stolen it, until the universe, or fate, or maybe just the cold balance of justice, handed me something far sharper than any words I could have spoken. My sister's pedestal cracked right there on that table, and in the stunned silence that followed, I finally understood the power of not having to lift a finger. The dinner continued in stiff, awkward fragments, plates pushed aside, glasses left half full, no one daring to return to small talk as though the night hadn't just turned inside out. My boss met my eyes across the table, gave me the faintest nod, and I knew without a word that he understood exactly what this moment meant. My father sat back, shoulders slumped, the letter still between his fingers, and for the first time in my life, his pride had no place to stand. And as I sat there, silent but burning, I realized that this was only the beginning. When the plates were finally cleared and the waiters retreated to that soft perimeter where service becomes surveillance, I sat with my napkin twisted in my lap and let the steam of the whole scene rise in my head like a kettle left on the burner. Because if I did not name what had always been there, then the night would harden into one more family story about how I was dramatic and sensitive and a little ungrateful, and I was not going to let them keep that story without at least hearing mine. In the tone I live in every day. I grew up in a house where my sister was the morning sun that everyone arranged their schedules around, while I was the porch light that somehow stayed on through storms and outages and never got thanked for the electricity. And even when I brought home report cards full of praise and washed dishes and clocked hours at a grocery store to cover little gaps that mysteriously became my responsibility, there was always some shine to her that made my efforts look like chores rather than choices, and it is funny in a tired way how long you can pretend you do not notice a scale that never lands even. There was the car she got when she turned that sweet age with a cake and a key in the frosting, and there was me with a laminated bus schedule and a lecture about grit. There were the summers she spent collecting experiences that somehow needed sponsorship and sympathy in equal measure, while I stacked shifts at a coffee shop and learned how to reset a broken espresso machine because the manager could not be bothered. There was the college application season where my mother cried real tears over essay drafts that read like travel brochures, and I learned that financial aid offices take walk-ins if you stand there long enough with the right folder and a spine. And if I sound bitter, it is only because I carried the weight of everyone else's lightness until my hands developed calluses that nobody admired. The favoritism was never announced like a family policy. It just leaked into everything like a slow pipe behind a wall, and you live with the damp until the paint bubbles, and by then the studs are soft and you are paying for repairs nobody will ever admit were necessary. So when my father tossed his joke across the table and my boss followed it with that letter, I felt the old script stutter, and in that flicker I saw a path I had been too tired to take before. One that did not require me to shout or perform or roast anyone in public, because I am good at a quip and I have a mean streak when provoked, but I have learned that the prettiest revenge is the kind that looks like housekeeping. I lifted my glass and kept my voice even, the way you do in meetings when a point must land without leaving fingerprints, and I thanked my parents for making me independent. Not with sarcasm, not with a wink, but with a careful honesty that made my mother stare into her water and made my father tuck his chin, because somewhere inside they know that resilience is often a side effect of neglect, and if that stings, then maybe the dosage fits the condition. I did not mention my sister by name, because the letter on the table was already doing more work than any of my sentences could, and I am not a pyromaniac, I am a planner who finally got handed a match. The waiters returned with the indulgent dessert my boss had arranged, and as the sparklers fizzed down to smoke I caught the server's sleeve and asked for the check, not to make some grand flourish about independence, but to draw a line where lines belong. Because every family has an economy and ours has always run on my quiet contributions and their loud narratives. When the leather folder arrived, I slid in my own card and tucked a note beneath the edge, not for the table, not for the staff, but for myself, a single sentence that said, "Tonight I cover the bill and tomorrow I stop covering the costs that are not mine." Which sounds simple and stony until you remember that for years I have paid for streaming passwords and shared phone plans and the kind of recurring little charges that keep people comfortable enough to tell jokes at your expense. I scheduled the cancellations on my phone while my father pretended to reread the letter and my sister tried to reconstruct a version of events. where this was all a misunderstanding, and I felt petty for exactly one heartbeat before the feeling gave way to something like air returning to a room after a door that has been stuck for years finally opens. If that sounds small compared to the melodrama of public humiliation, then you have never felt the thrill of turning off a hidden faucet and watching the puddle recede, because a woman can live on boundaries the way a desert plant lives on dew, and yes, there is a touch of humor in the fact that the first thing I cut was the premium package my father loves for his sports, and the family plan that let everyone ignore their own bills while lecturing me about responsibility, and I will not pretend. It did not feel like a clean little victory to write a thank you on the tip line that matched the number in my head when I thought about hours worked and respect owed. My boss caught my eye and gave the smallest nod, the kind you exchange with someone who understands that revenge does not always need an audience, and when we stood to leave I hugged my mother gently and told my father to drive safe. A phrase that sounds polite until you remember who really kept the roads salted all those winters. Out in the cool air by the valet stand, my sister finally found her voice and asked me, trying and failing to sound casual, whether I had known anything about this before tonight. And I watched her study my face the way you look at a closed door when you cannot remember where you left the key, and I answered with an honesty that was not cruel, but was certainly not soft, telling her that sometimes the only thing you need to know is your own threshold and that mine had shifted, which is the truth. Although it is not the detail she wanted. She looked past me toward my boss as though he might rescue the script she was losing, and I let the pause stretch long enough for her to hear the echo of it. My phone buzzed with the first confirmation email, calm and transactional, and I slipped it back into my bag with the same composure I wear in boardrooms. Then I smiled in that way people do when the truth finally fits. And I told her that if she needed advice on returning company property, she should check the closet in the den where our father hides his old trophies, because the laptop charger she borrowed lives behind them. And it would be a shame to have the wrong missing item added to the list in the morning, which landed like a soft punch wrapped in silk and left her blinking in a way that told me the message had reached its destination. And as the valet pulled up the cars and the night breathed out, I saw the shape of a reckoning that had not yet arrived, and if I sounded almost kind when I told her to get some sleep, it is only because I was saving the sharper edge for tomorrow. The next morning arrived with the kind of stillness that tricks you into thinking the world has not changed, but I knew better, because the tremor of yesterday's revelation had settled into every corner of my thoughts. And even the sun streaming through the kitchen window seemed sharper, as though it had been sharpened for clarity rather than warmth, illuminating the quiet satisfaction of survival, the subtle acknowledgement that finally, my efforts had been validated beyond the small, dismissive ecosystem of my family's preferences. I poured coffee with deliberate slowness, savoring the steam and aroma as if it were a small, tangible reward for all the years I had spent proving myself. Knowing that the cup in my hand was a testament to the fact that recognition need not always be loud or ceremonious, that there was power in the work itself and the patience it demanded, even when others refused to notice. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and I felt a strange freedom in that quiet, the kind that comes when you understand that the story you have carried for decades is finally shifting, not because anyone else has changed, but because you have. Because you have absorbed the lessons of neglect and ambition, and folded them into a resolve that cannot be undermined by sarcasm or envy. Memories of childhood floated unbidden into my mind with an odd mix of tenderness and bitterness, because it is impossible to recall years of constant comparison without recognizing the particular sharpness of each slight, the careful, almost surgical way my achievements were minimized while my sister's errors were excused or celebrated for their charm. I remembered the afternoons spent in the library, my fingers tracing the edges of textbooks that never seemed heavy enough to carry the dreams I had stacked inside my head, while my sister drifted through classes with an ease that was both enviable and frustrating, her grades praised not for diligence, but for perceived potential, her failures shrugged off like minor plot twists in a story she was always cast to win. I had learned early that visibility could be selective, that recognition could be rationed unfairly, and that you could grow up under the same roof, breathing the same air, and still inhabit completely different worlds of Expectation and esteem, a lesson that tastes like iron on the tongue when you first encounter it, but eventually hardens into a tool you wield silently, almost invisibly. By the time I arrived at the office, the parking lot hummed with the soft rhythm of engines and footsteps. The predictable chaos of a Monday morning meeting filtered through my newfound lens of quiet triumph. My team greeted me with congratulations, their voices warm and unforced, and I allowed myself the indulgence of a genuine smile, because after years of carrying responsibility that went unacknowledged, the affirmation that came from colleagues who had seen the labor and persistence behind my name was deeply sustaining. My office, meticulously arranged with files and notes, felt less like a workspace and more like a territory I had claimed, one that could not be undermined by familial disregard or envy, a small kingdom in which my authority was real, recognized, and unassailable. When my boss arrived for our scheduled one-on-one, there was an unmistakable weight in his gaze, a recognition that transcended professional courtesy. Acknowledging that the narrative of the previous evening had shifted the dynamics in ways that would ripple outward beyond the confines of the dining room or even the office walls. He spoke about my promotion, the responsibilities it entailed, and the projects that awaited, but beneath the surface was an understanding that the most significant victory had already occurred, in the private acknowledgement of competence, in the subtle restoration of dignity, in the knowledge that my family's hierarchy had been disrupted without me having to make a scene, without shouting, without dramatics, only through the quiet presentation of truth. The day unfolded with a mixture of tasks and meetings, but I noticed the small differences, the way colleagues deferred to my opinion with slightly more weight, the way suggestions I made were taken with immediate consideration, and the subtle glance from my boss that spoke volumes about the unspoken layers of yesterday's events. Every email I sent, every call I returned, felt charged with an underlying narrative, the implicit understanding that I had reclaimed something that had been denied to me for years, and that reclamation had shifted the air around me. The way wind shifts a curtain, revealing what was hidden behind. By late afternoon, when the sun had moved low and cast elongated shadows across the office floor, I found myself alone for a moment, reviewing reports and making strategic notes. And I allowed the thought to surface that for all the years my family had cultivated the illusion of favoritism, there was now a balance restored that required no vindictive display, only the calm assertion of presence and capability. I thought of my sister, the letter, the look on my father's face, and the unspoken recognition that the pedestal he had built for her was no longer secure, and that realization, though quiet, was a form of justice in itself. The kind that leaves a lingering awareness, a tension that cannot be erased by excuses or apologies. As I packed my things to leave, the office lights dimming in anticipation of evening, I allowed myself one last reflection on the subtle triumphs of patience, the quiet, almost invisible power of integrity, and the satisfaction of knowing that a night of tension, a letter, and years of perseverance had converged to rewrite the expectations set upon me, leaving those who underestimated me to reconcile their assumptions with reality, and in that, I found a calm certainty that the real measure of success is not applause, but the unwavering knowledge of one's own worth, finally recognized both by others and by oneself. The next evening, the subtle reverberations of yesterday's revelations were still circulating through my family, a quiet tension that had replaced the casual superiority my father always wielded like a shield, and as I arrived at my parents' house, I noticed immediately how different the atmosphere felt, the room slightly colder, the lighting harsher, as if the house itself had adjusted to the disruption in its usual narrative, and I carried myself carefully through the foyer, not out of fear, but from the understanding that the unfolding consequences required patience and observation, that the collapse of long-held illusions often arrives slowly and unevenly, leaving jagged edges that can cut even the innocent observer. My sister met me in the kitchen, her attempt at casual conversation brittle and hollow, a voice tuned to charm but trembling under the weight of her own unspoken anxiety. And I watched her maneuver through sentences that tried to reconstruct normalcy while the entire foundation of her assumed invincibility had already begun to crumble, knowing that every effort she made only highlighted the fragility she had cultivated so meticulously for years. It was impossible not to recall the countless occasions when she had been praised for minimal effort, when her missteps were reframed as amusing anecdotes or learning experiences. While I had absorbed lectures on responsibility for achievements that required far more grit, and the contrast between our paths became painfully vivid in the current moment, as if the universe had paused to illustrate the fairness of consequence. Subtle yet undeniable, a lesson that is never immediate but becomes increasingly impossible to ignore once it is set in motion. I placed my belongings on the counter and offered a measured greeting to my parents, who avoided eye contact, their usual performances of pride and control muted by the silent knowledge that the pedestal they had built for my sister was beginning to tilt. And that tilt was now visible not only to them but to everyone in the room, and I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sympathy, because justice delivered in the quiet of consequence rarely comes without collateral emotion, and I knew the sting would teach lessons they might resist, but could not deny. As the evening progressed, the details of my sister's termination began to surface, delivered in fragments as my father and mother attempted to frame the situation without losing control of their narrative. Their words faltering under the weight of facts that could not be glossed over, and I listened attentively, not because I needed confirmation, but because witnessing the subtle unraveling of arrogance and entitlement was a lesson in human behavior, in the fragility of reputations built on perception rather than substance. My boss had made the letter concise, professional, and unassailable, and the silence that followed its revelation carried more authority than any argument I could have mustered, leaving my family to confront the stark reality that their golden child was, in fact, mortal, fallible, and subject to the same rules and expectations they had imposed unevenly for years. I noticed the micro-expressions on their faces, my mother's fingers drumming nervously against the edge of the table, my father's jaw tightening as he processed the information without the usual retorts or justifications, my sister's eyes darting between us, searching for an ally in a room where her usual allies had been rendered powerless by truth. I did not speak at first, because speech would have been unnecessary, a distraction from the weight of acknowledgement, and sometimes the most effective form of revenge is silence, an unadorned presence that allows the other party to observe their own miscalculations and insecurities fully, without interference, until they arrive at the conclusions that are both inevitable and instructive. Later, when dinner was served and conversation had tentatively resumed, I observed how my family recalibrated, attempting to mask embarrassment with small talk, but their attempts lacked the authority or confidence of prior gatherings. And I realized that the power dynamics had shifted permanently, even if subtly, because once the illusion of invincibility is pierced, it cannot be fully restored without acknowledgement of the fracture. I contributed minimally to the conversation, allowing others to navigate the awkwardness, offering the occasional factual comment or neutral observation, each statement chosen to reinforce competence and composure rather than to provoke. Understanding that the collapse of a carefully curated image is most instructive when witnessed without interference, when the realization is allowed to sink in organically. By the time the evening drew to a close, the tension in the room had not dissipated entirely, but had transformed into a new equilibrium, one where the hierarchy my family had always enforced was no longer absolute. And I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that consequences had arrived through natural channels, reinforced by evidence and observed rather than narrated. Walking to the door, I glanced back once, seeing my sister linger near the window, her posture betraying a mix of confusion, frustration, and begrudging understanding. And I realized that the reverberations of this evening would extend far beyond the confines of this house, shaping interactions, expectations, and the perception of capability in ways that would continue to unfold in the coming days. In that moment, I understood that some victories are measured not by applause or acknowledgement, but by the subtle, irreversible shift in the landscape that cannot be ignored, and that is a power far more enduring than any spoken reprimand or celebratory toast. The days following the revelation at the dinner stretched out with a slow, deliberate tension, each moment carrying the residual weight of unspoken truths and unacknowledged victories. And I moved through them with a measured composure that concealed the quiet satisfaction simmering beneath the surface, understanding fully that the most potent form of revenge is neither loud nor immediate, but sustained, subtle, and undeniable. Because when a person has spent decades in the shadow of favoritism, the ultimate triumph is watching that hierarchy erode from the inside while you remain composed, aware, and untouchable in ways that cannot be disputed by sarcasm, denial, or guilt. My family's attempts to re-establish normalcy were as clumsy as they were revealing, with my father's voice carrying a forced neutrality and my mother's gestures tinged with the anxiety of a careful observer trying to balance decorum against the undeniable reality of her eldest daughter's termination, while my sister floated through conversations with the grace of someone desperately clutching at an illusion that had been shattered with one simple, formal document. And I found that allowing them to navigate this new landscape without intervention gave me a satisfaction that was almost sacred, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement that power had shifted quietly but irrevocably. Evenings that were once punctuated with casual competitions over attention and praise became exercises in negotiation, where each word, each glance, each subtle inflection carried more weight than any outward declaration. And I observed my family with the patience of someone studying the movement of chess pieces, understanding that the consequences of their previous indulgences and misjudgments were now unfolding in real time, teaching lessons they had long assumed they could dictate. And I let them play out, silent but attentive, knowing that every misstep, every awkward pause, every carefully measured smile or hesitation added to the permanent record of consequence that no apology could erase. The house, familiar in its structure yet transformed in its atmosphere, carried the echoes of these shifts, from the quiet tension in the hallway to the subdued conversations around the table. Each space a reflection of the recalibration taking place not through confrontation but through observation and self-reflection imposed by circumstance, and I moved through it with a quiet, almost imperceptible authority that was entirely my own, earned through years of effort, patience, and silent endurance. When my sister finally confronted me, attempting to reclaim some semblance of the narrative she had always assumed was hers, her voice carried a blend of defiance and uncertainty, and I met it with a calm honesty that required no dramatics, no sharp retort. Only the clear presentation of my own perspective and the implicit understanding that truth has a weight of its own that cannot be manipulated or dismissed, and I watched the recognition, grudging as it was, settle across her features in subtle shifts that confirmed the effectiveness of patience, presence, and timing as tools of influence, the kind of influence that reshapes relationships without the need for aggression, coercion, or spectacle. And I realized that the quiet assertion of competence and integrity can dismantle long-held assumptions more efficiently than any argument or display of anger. As the days progressed, the recalibration of our interactions became increasingly apparent in the small details, the measured tone of my father's comments, the cautious consideration in my mother's inquiries, the hesitations in my sister's attempts at conversation, each gesture reflecting an unconscious acknowledgement that the pedestal she had occupied was no longer stable, that the assumptions she had relied upon for security were now vulnerable, and that I, by virtue of having lived through the years of comparison, neglect, and understated labor, now held a presence that demanded consideration without overt assertion, a recognition that presence alone, when cultivated through competence and patience, exerts influence that is far more enduring than words or declarations. By the end of the week, I found myself reflecting on the paradoxical nature of this quiet triumph, understanding that the most profound victories are rarely broadcast or applauded, but are instead experienced internally and observed externally, leaving those who underestimated you to reconcile their assumptions with reality while you remain fully in control of your own narrative, a situation that requires no gloating, no confrontation, only the steady acknowledgement of fact, capability, and self-respect. My sister's avoidance, my parents' muted adjustments, and the subtle recalibration of our family dynamic all contributed to a sense of completion that was both satisfying and instructive, demonstrating that the culmination of years of patience, effort, and endurance manifests not in spectacle, but in the lasting shift of perception and expectation, a shift that is irrevocable because it has been internalized and validated by experience rather than performance. As I closed the door behind me that night, leaving the house in its tense equilibrium, I understood that revenge had not required a single sharp word or overt confrontation, that justice had arrived in the form of quiet consequence, and that the recalibration of familial hierarchy was both enduring and instructive, a reminder that recognition, once earned and acknowledged, carries a power that extends far beyond the immediate moment, and that the true measure of triumph lies not in the applause of others, but in the unwavering understanding of one's own worth, silently observed and undeniably felt.